My name is Wes Regan, and I'm here to share with you some of my experience as a social entrepreneur. So Sean touched briefly on some stuff about me. I am Vice President of Urban Stream Innovation. We are a food systems technology firm here in Vancouver, focusing on reducing the carbon footprint of the food system. I'm also the treasurer and a founding director of the Vancouver Urban Farming Society, which is an organization that's focusing on capacity building and policy advocacy around urban farming. And of course, Hastings Crossing BIA, which is just down the street from here. I'd like to acknowledge my chair for the BIA who's in the room here, Heather O'Hara. But tonight I want to focus on, I'm going to get used to this in a second, oh, and also proud SFU alumnus, thank you. How could I forget? How could I forget? Good-looking kilt, isn't it? County Roscoe, Ireland. So why do I want to focus on changing the food system in my career, which is a large part of what I do? Well, I was born in Inuvik in the Northwest Territories, which is just the top left-hand corner of the Northwest Territories near the border of Yukon, just south of Tuktoyaktuk, if you've ever heard it. And I grew up in a little resource town called Norman Wells up there, which was right on the Mackenzie River. And we'd have to wait for the ice to break up in the springtime with these large, booming cracks of the ice heaving up and calving off and falling. And that would be the kind of the announcement that your food is arriving shortly. On the right-hand side there's a barge. We'd wait for these barges to come up often in the spring and summer. They'd bring tons and tons of food. And oftentimes that food was very expensive, and sometimes the quality was pretty poor, but it really was one of the only links we had to where food was coming from. So at a young age, I was fairly aware of this sort of dichotomy between the faraway, remote, rural community and where all this food was coming from. Later on in my childhood, I moved down to Kelowna with my family, and even there, once again, in one of the fastest growing urban communities in Canada, we saw this competition between housing developments and suburbs just sprawling out in Kelowna, and this conflict sort of with land use and planning around the agricultural land reserve. And what was happening at the time was, in the fall in the Okanagan, it used to be that you would smell the peaches and the apples sort of naturally fermenting on the ground, and it was this incredible waft in the air of fruits. And over time, we saw a lot of these orchards replaced by the monocrops in the form of grapes, because of course, with the economics of land, grapes made more sense than peaches or apples. And so even in Kelowna, once again, I'm looking at land and food and communities and was thinking to myself, there's a lot of interesting stuff here going on. And so eventually ended up at SFU, and it changed my life. I fell in love with human geography, and I met some amazing friends. And I participated in some amazing experiences, the work integrated learning that Jen had mentioned earlier. I was lucky to take part in that. And SFU Co-op, which I recommend to any student who's now considering going to school. Co-op was where I met this handsome fellow, Nick Hermes, and we fell in love with urban farming and aquaponics. Nick had just finished his thesis at UBC on sustainable food production, which I try not to hold against him. And we were looking at food security and local economic development potential around urban agriculture and other sort of value-add food processes in the downtown east side. And we saw these same problems in the food system, but from very different angles. Nick from the perspective of a scientist, myself from the perspective of an urban geographer. A system that was reliant on so much fossil fuel, so many chemicals, was reliant on overfishing, on horrible and inefficient ways of getting food from one place to the other, and of course, a complete lack of dealing with the food waste that we produce as well. And so we thought, how can we create a more resilient and transparent food system for an increasingly urbanized and food insecure world? And building on some previous work that Nick had done around the idea of a food resource park, we developed a more diffuse or aggregate model of looking at ways to compost and grow food in cities, and we termed this thing the microfarm. This one here is up at Granville and 14th at a restaurant called Luke's Corner Bar and Kitchen, and we're working with a couple of restaurants up there to divert food scraps and grow food in this thing. And what we do is essentially, we focus on biomimicry, which is, we've created a contained ecosystem within the shipping container. And we maximize the ability to grow food, and we reduce the cost of growing food by tapping into the value of those food scraps that are there, namely the heat and the nutrients that we can capture from that system. So here's a peek inside. We're growing between 4 to 6 pounds of leafy herbs and veggies per day for the restaurants up there in South Granville. On the bottom, there's little trays of mushrooms that are growing as well. And in the back there is our two-tiered composting unit. We're able to break down about 100 pounds of food scraps from the kitchen per day there for Luke's. This was just before the unit was fully up and running, so it's not 100% operational. There's an up-close shot of some basil that we were growing there. The root structure on this, I was told by Nick, was very impressive. And there's another shot. One of the finished outputs that we have are worm castings, which are incredible soil amendment. They're very nutrient rich. And some of the challenges with composting right now is that when you start composting in your yard, you don't necessarily have a finished compost that you can use for something. So we wanted to really find a way that we could use every single input that we get our hands on and have nothing but usable outputs at the end, so that nothing was wasted in this process. So where does coloring outside the lines come in all this, which was the title of my presentation earlier? Well, we discovered over the last 3 years or so that if you don't exist on paper as far as a bureaucrat is concerned, you don't exist. And so finding ways for us to do what we wanted to do, taking into consideration the needs of cities, of municipalities, or regions to regulate things, was one big learning curve that we encountered. When it came to permits, approved uses, all those sort of things, we found that we were trying to be they would try and fit us into one box or the other. It wasn't so much that they would go, hey, you got a really cool idea, and you're hitting a couple of different sustainability goals and these things, so let's see how the bureaucracy can kind of reshape itself around you and help you along. It was more like, you can be this or this or this or that, but you can't necessarily be what it is you are. But what we found is that because what we're offering touches on a couple of different areas that municipalities and regions want to see innovation around, that the bureaucracy at a couple of different levels has actually been willing to engage us on this because, well, we've been pretty well behaved. We also understand that financing is difficult too, and so piecing together the financing for our concept, because it was so exotic, was also a challenge. We're growing food in a way that challenges cultural norms. We've relied on partnerships and all sorts of stuff. And so we also discovered there's a lot of room for social innovation in the food system and the food economy. And this is a shot from the Vancouver Urban Farming Forum. It was at SFU Woodwards in 2011. There's a lot of people in Vancouver doing some amazing work. And we have lenders like Van City, we have the post-secondary institutions, and a lot of nonprofits who have been collaborating on some extremely innovative projects. So Urban Stream isn't alone in this ecosystem that involves lenders, involves investors, involves social innovators, many of whom are in this picture here and in this room here tonight. I also wanted to acknowledge Van City once again, because a great example of an institution that is finding ways to be innovative in its own rights, finding ways to lend or invest, or in this case, award young entrepreneurs. This is the Good Money Venture Impact Challenge, of which we placed third in last year. Another food systems or urban farming nonprofit, Fresh Roots, placed second. And so the year ahead for Urban Stream, we have got a lot of good media attention lately. We appeared on the cover of the Vancouver Sun, and since then we've been fielding interest from all over, from the US, from Canada, the Sunshine Coast, and we have several deals right now on top of the ones that we just finished. So we feel that there is so much room for innovation in our food system, but not only the food system, but all the different systems that we work with. And so my belief is that solid and innovative business thinking combined with a passion to address the social, economic, and environmental challenges that we face will create the most successful and game-changing businesses of this century. Cultural norms must be challenged, and outdated institutional frameworks will bend, in some cases break, and rearrange under this pressure. And I think that we shouldn't be afraid of this. Have courage. Change is good.